Welcome to episode 13. This is the episode on EQ, EQ basics. Going to let you know the different parts of an equalizer and what their functions are and the do's and don'ts of equalization. So let's get into it. So what is equalization? Well, EQ is modifying the frequency response of a sound. And the tool that we use is the equalizer. So let's look at a couple of equalizers. Here's two equalizers that both have an XY field of frequency and amplitude. And you notice that both of them, the lines are flat going across, and they both start around 20 hertz and they go up to 20,000 hertz. That is the listening capability of a human being, basically. The horizontal axis is frequency, going from left to right. It's low frequencies to high frequencies. 1,000 hertz is in the middle, and you can see that it's a logarithmic scale. It's easier to notice change in frequency with your hearing with frequencies below 1,000 hertz than it is with frequencies above 1,000 hertz. 1,000 hertz is pretty high, actually. And you get up into between 5,000 and 10,000 hertz, you see it's just a little area here. The difference between 500 and 100 is a big area. So easy for the ear to perceive frequency changes below 1,000 hertz. It's the same thing here on this equalizer. Above 1,000 hertz to 10,000 hertz is this space here, and then 20 hertz to 1,000 hertz is this space here. So you have the capability of cutting and boosting frequencies with an equalizer. Here, if we boost at 2,000 hertz, we see the change. We're on a scale of 24 dB. Let's bring that down to 12, and you see it jumps up higher. Bring it down to 6, and it goes up through the roof there. So you have boost and you have cut with any given frequency. So you select the frequency and you select the cut and the boost. This is known as a bell curve. You also have the ability to change the slope, how drastically the change occurs, whether it occurs over a very small area or it occurs over a very large area. The tone on your radio in your car is going to be over a large area. So that's a bell curve. The bell curve, you have Q, gain, and frequency. It's the same way for all these bell curves. We have 5 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We go from low frequency to low mid, to high mid, to high. Most equalizers have 5 areas. You can see here on this equalizer, low frequency, low mid, high frequency. And then on either end of both equalizers, we have a high cut frequency and a low cut frequency. Those are also known as high pass and low pass filters. You can see that as you go up higher, it rolls off low frequencies. You have control over the slope of it. It can roll it off gently or it can roll it off very quickly. So that is a high pass filter. It's called a high pass filter because it lets all the higher frequencies above where your frequency you select is, it allows those frequencies to pass. Conversely, a high cut filter is called a low pass filter. Wherever you adjust it to, the frequencies lower are allowed to pass through the circuit. So that's the difference between a low pass and a high pass. In the low frequency and the high frequency sections of both of these equalizers, we have a choice of peaking or shelf. Now, peaking is just another word for bell curve. So the Q is active here. We have a choice, though, of what's called a shelf. And you see here that the shelf is gentle. Now the shelf is more hardcore with the slope. 24 dB is very extreme. 6 dB is more gentle. So this would be like the bass and treble controls on a consumer piece of gear. More than likely you'd have this up around 200 or 300 hertz and you'd push that and it'd get bassier. They get thinner by doing that. On a consumer piece of gear, this might be down around 2,500 hertz. Push it up for it to get brighter, pull it down for it to get duller. So that's what a shelf can do. There's a bell, there's a shelf. So it's a good idea to know what different frequencies sound like on different instruments. That way, when you're making EQ decisions, you're making them by imagining how you want to change the sound instead of just turning the knobs and seeing what happens. It's always best to visualize what you're trying to do with sound when you're recording and mixing, instead of guessing. Here I have a piano track that's soloed, and we have an equalizer inserted on the piano track. Okay, so that's the sound of the piano without using any EQ. To give you an idea of what different areas sound like, let's mess around with this a little bit. So that's 2,000 hertz, and you notice it's brighter, and it's not a pretty brightness. It's very harsh sounding. (2,000 to 3,000 hertz), your ears are very sensitive to those frequencies. That's the frequency of like sirens and warning buzzers and things. That's the reason they put them in that frequency range, because your ears are very sensitive to it. So I give you up to, here's 3,000. It's kind of a piercing area of sound. And the piano is a very broad sounding instrument, so it's a good instrument to do some playing around with frequencies. So let's look at low mids. This is 1,000 hertz, around 1,000 hertz. This is in the human voices range right here. You know, your ears are very sensitive to 1,000 hertz. Now, let's go lower. Pretty quickly, it changes pretty drastically. You get down to around 700 hertz, and it has kind of a honky, boxy sound to it. Then you get lower, around 400 and 500. That just sounds kind of, that's starting to get that woolly kind of sound, that kind of sound. Get lower. Get around 250 and you start feeling that round low end. That's 250 is where you're first starting to figure out, oh, that sounds like low frequencies. That sounds like bass. Get down around 150. More of a bass sort of thing. Not as round sounding as 250. It has more punch to it. Let's get lower. 90 or 100 right there. Okay, so when you get below 100 hertz, that's kind of rumble. You get into the 80 hertz and below, that's getting into rumbly things. And you have to have instruments that actually put out bass sounds to hear that, like synthesizers and bass guitars, that sort of thing. A piano is not going to put out a heck of a lot of 80 hertz and below. All right, I was just talking about bass frequencies. Well, let's put a bass guitar up, okay, and play with the equalizer on a bass guitar and see how it affects a bass guitar. Now you can already see that the bass, you get above 500 and get into 1,000, there's just not much information there. You remember the piano. See, the piano is just all the way across the spectrum because it's a very full frequency instrument. Let's play around with the different frequencies on a bass. So you push that low end on a bass and boy, it gets powerful, huh? Look at that, pushing that, where are we, 34 hertz. Let's put that on a, that's on a bell. Let's put it on a shelf. So there you go. We're shelving 110 hertz and below. And that's just a lot of low frequency information. It's very big. I don't know what kind of speakers you're listening to this on, or headphones, but you'll notice that really does change. There's a lot of low frequency energy in that signal right there. Let's look at mid-range on a bass. Let's take this right here. Boom, 500 hertz. So that's sweeping. If you notice, just notice the frequencies as I sweep through them. If you can see here, this is 200, 500, and 1,000. Listen to the difference in sound here. $500, $200, $500, $1,000, $2,000. There's really nothing up here in the 5,000. Well, this is 5,000. I apologize. Yeah, you can hear 3,000 on a bass. You get up into, you see where it disappears here around 5,000. So that's a good example, the different characteristics going across the frequency spectrum to hear the different frequencies of the bass guitar as you sweep through the frequency range. Okay, here is a little track I put together for the series to explain plugins. We have a drum track, a bass track. The bass guitar and the drums don't have any EQ on them, nor does the acoustic guitar. If I roll the track, actually I did work on the bass guitar. I did a little bit of compression and some EQ. I'm going to leave that alone for right now. I took the drums, these two purple tracks right here, which are up here, and I ran them into a bus, and I called it the drum bus. And I put an equalizer on the drum bus. So you're going to hear that the drums, I want to make them a little bit brighter, a little bit more, have a little bit more sheen. Okay, and I just put a little bit of 5K with a bell and a little bit of 10K on a shelf. So A being it. So you can hear with that little bit of high end that I added on the drums, helps the track out a little bit. Now, another thing that needs to be having a little bit of help is this acoustic guitar right here. I did an EQ on it in the plug-in episode, and I'll show you what difference it makes in the track here. I'm going to leave the EQ the same. What I did was I high-passed it up to 150, then went down to 100 and put a little bit of boost in, went to 470, cut it a little bit, went to 10K and boosted it a little bit. The guitar sounds like this without EQ. Sounds like this with EQ. Here I'll A-B it. Listen to it in the track with EQ and without EQ. Just a little subtle difference. You notice I don't make a lot of extreme moves with equalization. The idea being that when you record something, you want to get pretty close to it in the first place. This acoustic guitar here, I didn't use an EQ or compression when I recorded it, but I did have to use very little EQ to get it to work in the track. How to use EQ is mainly the idea of knowing what frequencies you hear in your head that need to be louder or softer for any given part in a mix, or while you're recording or while you're mixing. So the fewer elements you have in your track, the more sonic space each element can take up, and the more intimate it can be, the more it can be in your face. If you have a vocal and an acoustic guitar and maybe one other instrument, well, you can get those three elements right up front and sound very pretty with a lot of frequency response with each element. But as you add elements to your track, the less sonic space is available for each part, each instrument. And so then you have to start making decisions. What part of the frequency spectrum is the most important part of the frequency spectrum for this part, this instrument? And if there's overlap between two parts, two instruments in a certain frequency range, you have to make a decision of, okay, which one gets preferential treatment here? If you have an overlap in the area of 300 or 400 hertz between two instruments, which one should be ducked at 300 or 400 hertz in order to give room for the other instrument, because it requires that and it helps your track out more. So how to not use EQ? One of the most important things about not using EQ is not using it if you don't need to. If something isn't broke, don't try and fix it. I remember when I first started out, and I was an assistant engineer, and they gave me studio time when I'd come in and start working on stuff without clients just to learn. I'd pull up the fader, and the first thing I'd do is I'd start turning EQ knobs just because they were on the board. You know, oh, EQ, I gotta EQ this. Half the time I didn't need to turn any EQ knobs, but I didn't know that at that point in time. So it's a good thing that you might know that now. Just because you have EQ doesn't mean you have to use it. Just because you have any device doesn't mean you have to use that device. You have to visualize what needs to occur sonically and then figure out what tools do I need. Do I need to use EQ? Don't use EQ just because you own EQ. A lot of people get trapped into the idea that in order to make something sound better, you have to boost high end and low end or whatever the frequency is, that you have to boost it. You find out that if you're doing nothing but boosting frequencies, then you're creating harsh sounding mixes. If you think something needs to be brighter, sometimes it's smarter to take the lower frequencies and reduce them and then bring the overall level of that element, that instrument, up in your track. That way you're not warping the high end by making adjustments in the high end. You're keeping that natural curve intact, and you're allowing it to come up in volume with that natural curve by getting the lower frequencies out of the way. So cutting frequencies and raising the overall sound of that element a lot of the time works better than just boosting high frequencies. There are times when boosting high frequencies really does work as well, though. You just got to make that decision when you're doing it. EQ plugins emulate two kinds of equalizers: transparent equalizers and equalizers that color the sound. Now, what do we mean by equalizers that color the sound? Well, equalizers are amplifiers, and most amplifiers have a volume knob on them and maybe some tone control. Well, this amplifier happens to have a lot of tone control. And so in an equalizer that emulates an amplifier of analog color, when you are changing the tone, the EQ, you're introducing distortion, because that's what that vintage piece of gear did. It's pretty distortion, it's harmonic distortion, but it also colors the sound. So you have to make a decision whether or not, when you want to EQ something, if it already has a nice color to it and you've already created that color through an amplification plugin or recording an amplifier, then you're going to want to use a transparent equalizer. However, if you have an instrument such as a bass guitar or something that's a very clean, direct recording right out of a bass guitar, you might want to add some color, some amplification, a little bit of harmonic distortion to that while you are EQing it. Under those circumstances, it'd be a good idea to use an EQ plugin that emulates an analog equalizer. So that does it for the basics of equalization. In the next episode, we get into the basics of compression, thresholds, ratios, makeup gain, release times, all that wonderful stuff. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe and continue watching the Home Studio for Beginners course here at Record Mix Repeat. I'm your host, Rusty Smith. Thanks for watching.